In a quiet, overlooked corner of rural Appalachia, where winding roads gave way to dense forests, stood the old farmhouse where 72-year-old Anna had spent her entire life. She was a woman shaped by the land itself, firm and unyielding. Her days were governed by the sun and the seasons, not by clocks or calendars. Though her hands were marked by age, they were skilled in the timeless arts of gardening, mending, and brewing herbal remedies for any ailment that dared to disturb her peace. A widow for nearly a decade, Anna guarded her independence with a fierce resolve that was both a source of pride for her family and a cause for their constant worry. Her deepest held conviction was a profound distrust of modern medicine. She viewed doctors as merchants of chemicals and hospitals as cold, sterile places where life went to end, not to be saved. This belief was forged in the painful memory of her husband, Robert, who had passed away in just such an institution. She had vowed then that she would never surrender her own fate to the impersonal machinery of medicine. This vow extended to the management of her diabetes, a condition she acknowledged but treated on her own terms, with a strict diet and bitter herbal teas. She stubbornly refused the insulin and regular checkups her granddaughter, Sarah, a nursing student in the city, pleaded with her to accept during their weekly phone calls. The incident that would irrevocably alter her quiet life occurred on a brilliant summer afternoon. The sun warmed the earth, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses from her garden. Anna was humming to herself, pulling weeds from around her tomato plants, lost in the simple, satisfying work. Stepping back to admire her progress, her foot came down hard on an old plank of wood that lay hidden in the overgrown grass. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg, and a cry escaped her lips. Cutting through the tranquility of the day, she hobbled to the porch steps, her face pale and beaded with sweat. With trembling hands, she untied the laces of her worn gardening shoe. A rusty, jagged nail had pierced straight through the sole and embedded itself deep into the arch of her foot. Gritting her teeth against the waves of pain, she took a firm hold of the nail's head and pulled. It came free with a sickening wrench, followed by a slow, sluggish trickle of dark blood. Anna, however, was not a woman given to panic. She considered the wound a nuisance, not a threat. Limping into her kitchen, she treated it as she had treated countless other cuts and scrapes throughout her life. She washed it with harsh soap and water, then doused a rag in turpentine and pressed it firmly against the puncture, wincing as it stung. She then tore a strip from an old dish towel and wrapped it tightly around her foot. Satisfied that the matter was settled, that night, a deep, rhythmic throbbing in her foot kept her from sleeping soundly. But she dismissed it as the body's natural way of healing. She was tragically mistaken. For a person with diabetes, such an injury was a serious danger. Her poor circulation starved the wound of the vital cells needed for repair, while her high blood sugar created a fertile breeding ground for the bacteria the rusty nail had delivered deep into her flesh. The dull throb soon intensified into a relentless, burning agony. The skin around the wound turned a dark, angry red, and her foot began to swell. By the end of the first week, Anna could no longer deny that something was seriously wrong. Her entire foot was now swollen and hot to the touch. A foul, yellowish fluid began to seep through the dish towel, staining it and creating a sickly sweet odor that started to permeate the small house. She confined herself to her late husband's armchair, keeping her leg elevated, her stubborn pride preventing her from admitting defeat and calling for help. When Sarah called for their weekly chat, Anna forced a cheerful, steady tone into her voice, assuring her granddaughter that everything was fine, blaming her tiredness on the summer heat. But she was far from fine. The infection was now raging, and dark, purplish lines had begun to snake their way up her ankle, a terrifying sign that the poison was spreading through her bloodstream. A persistent, low-grade fever clouded her thoughts, leaving her in a state of hazy confusion. It was then that she began to notice the flies. At first, there were only one or two, but their numbers grew, drawn by the undeniable scent of decay. They became bold, landing persistently on the soiled bandage around her foot. In her feverish days, Anna barely had the strength to wave them away, unaware that these creatures were not merely a nuisance. They were harbingers of a far more horrifying reality that was beginning to unfold within her own body. *. The second week descended into a nightmarish blur for Anna. The line between waking and dreaming dissolved as the fever took complete control of her mind. The infection, now a raging torrent in her bloodstream, brought with it terrifying hallucinations. She would see her late husband, Robert, standing by the window, beckoning her to join him in the garden, his face etched with a sorrow she couldn't comprehend. At other times, the floral patterns on her wallpaper would writhe and twist into grotesque shapes. Her body, starved of proper nutrition and hydration, began to fail. The once strong woman who could spend 10 hours under the sun now lacked the energy to even lift a glass of water to her lips. The house grew silent, save for the incessant, low hum of the flies. Meanwhile, in the city 100 miles away, Sarah was growing increasingly anxious. Her grandmother had missed their scheduled weekly call for the first time ever. At first, Sarah tried to reason with her fears. Maybe Anna was in the garden and didn't hear the phone, or perhaps the old cell service was acting up again. But when her subsequent calls over the next 2 days went straight to a crackly, automated voicemail, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. She knew her grandmother's stubborn pride better than anyone. That pride, which had once seemed like a charming quirk, now felt like a dangerous liability. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Sarah packed an overnight bag, left a message for her clinical instructor, and started the long drive out to the countryside. The journey was a torment of escalating worry. Every mile that passed seemed to stretch into 10. When she finally turned onto the familiar gravel road leading to the farmhouse, her heart sank. The vibrant, meticulously kept garden she remembered from her childhood visits was now tinged with neglect. Weeds were beginning to reclaim the flower beds, and the sunflowers drooped, their heavy heads facing the earth. An eerie silence hung over the property, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. A faint, cloying odor hung in the air, a smell she couldn't immediately place but which made her feel uneasy. She found the front door unlocked. Calling out, "Grandma, it's me, Sarah." Her voice was swallowed by the heavy stillness within. She stepped inside, and the smell was instantly stronger, thick and putrid. Her eyes scanned the familiar living room until they landed on the armchair in the corner. Anna was slumped in the chair, her head lolled to one side, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her skin was waxy and pale, except for 2 feverish spots of red high on her cheeks. Sarah rushed to her side, her nursing instincts taking over. She felt for a pulse. It was rapid and thready. Her grandmother's skin was hot and dry to the touch. She was severely dehydrated and in a state of septic shock. Then Sarah's gaze fell upon Anna's foot. It was propped up on the stool, swollen to twice its normal size, the flesh a mottled patchwork of angry red and a terrifying, dusky purple that bordered on black. The old dish towel was still wrapped around it, but it was now stiff and stained with a dark, foul-smelling discharge. The source of the horrific smell was immediately apparent. It was the scent of necrotic, dying tissue. Fighting back a wave of nausea and tears, Sarah knew they were out of time. Her grandmother's fierce independence had led her to the brink of death. Pulling out her cell phone with shaking hands, her fingers flying across the screen, she dialed 911. As she frantically explained the situation to the dispatcher, her voice a mixture of clinical urgency and terrified pleading. She looked at the silent, still form of the woman who had raised her, praying it wasn't already too late. The distant wail of a siren was the only answer. The arrival of the paramedics was a whirlwind of controlled urgency that shattered the deathly quiet of the farmhouse. 2 men, their faces etched with professional calm, moved with a practiced efficiency, while one began assessing Anna's vital signs, calling out the dangerously low blood pressure and rapid heart rate. The other gently cut away the pant leg to get a clearer view of the source of the infection. He recoiled slightly at the sight of the swollen, discolored limb and the overpowering stench that emanated from the crude bandage. A quick, grim look was exchanged between the 2 medics. They had seen enough gangrenous wounds to know this was critical. They worked swiftly, inserting an 4-line into Anna's fragile arm to push fluids and antibiotics, and carefully placed an oxygen mask over her face as they prepared to move her. Sarah felt a paralyzing sense of guilt wash over her. Every overgrown weed in the garden, every layer of dust on the furniture, felt like a personal failing. She had been so caught up in her own life in the city, so easily placated by her grandmother's reassurances, that she had allowed this to happen. She watched as they loaded Anna onto a stretcher, her small, frail body looking lost amidst the medical equipment. The journey to the nearest regional hospital was agonizingly long. Sarah sat in the front of the ambulance, watching the familiar countryside blur past in a meaningless streak of green and brown. Behind her, in the back, the paramedics worked tirelessly, their voices a low, steady murmur of medical terminology that did little to comfort her. Upon their arrival at the emergency room, the scene shifted from the quiet tension of the ambulance to organized chaos. A team of doctors and nurses was waiting, and Anna was whisked away into a trauma bay. A young, serious-looking ER doctor began firing questions at Sarah. How long had she been like this? What were her underlying conditions? Did she take any medication? Sarah answered as best she could, her voice trembling as she explained her grandmother's diabetes and her deep-seated fear of doctors. The doctor listened intently, his expression growing more grave with each detail. He explained that Anna was in advanced septic shock. The infection from her foot had overwhelmed her body, and her organs were beginning to shut down. They managed to stabilize her. But the focus quickly shifted to the source of the crisis, her leg. The ER doctor called for an immediate surgical consult. Soon, a new figure appeared, a tall, weary-looking surgeon named Dr. Evans. He had the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades fighting losing battles against disease and injury. He reviewed Anna's chart, then turned to Sarah with eyes that offered no false hope. He explained that with diabetic patients, an infection of this severity, known as wet gangrene, almost always required a drastic intervention to stop it from spreading further and killing the patient. The dead tissue had to be removed. He led Sarah to the bedside, where Anna lay unconscious, hooked up to a symphony of beeping machines. Dr. Evans carefully lifted the blanket covering her leg. Even without removing the bandage, the signs were terrifyingly clear. The discoloration had now spread past her knee, and the limb was cold to the touch. He gently pressed a finger into the swollen flesh, and it left a deep indentation that did not spring back. "I need you to prepare yourself," he said, his voice low and direct. "To save your grandmother's life, we will almost certainly have to amputate the leg below the knee. Based on what I'm seeing here, the tissue is too far gone. It's the only way to stop the sepsis." Sarah felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Amputation. The word was a brutal, final sentence. It was the very thing her grandmother had feared most, losing a piece of herself to the surgeons she so deeply distrusted. As a nurse prepared a sterile tray to finally cut away the filthy bandage, everyone in the room braced themselves for the horrific sight of the rotted wound beneath. They thought they knew what they were about to see, but they were all wrong. Asterisk with a pair of sterile trauma shears, a young nurse began the grim task of cutting away the bandage. The cloth, stiff with dried fluids and grime, resisted at first, as the shears sliced through the final layers. The putrid smell that had filled the room intensified tenfold. A wave of decay so potent that one of the younger nurses instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Sarah stood frozen a few feet away, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal rail of the bed, her mind bracing for the sight of her grandmother's ruined flesh. The last piece of the bandage fell away, revealing the wound beneath the harsh glare of the examination light. For a moment, there was a collective, stunned silence. Then, a soft gasp rippled through the medical staff. The wound was a deep, cavernous crater in the arch of Anna's foot, its edges blackened and necrotic. But that wasn't what caused the shock. The center of the wound, the cavity itself, was alive. It was moving, a churning, writhing mass of pale, white forms. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of maggots writhed over one another, burrowing into the dead tissue, their segmented bodies glistening under the light. The sight was primal and deeply unsettling. Sarah felt a surge of bile rise in her throat, a horrified cry catching in her breath. This was a scene from a nightmare, a vision of absolute decay and horror. It seemed to confirm their worst fears. The leg was not just infected. It was being consumed, but Dr. Evans did not recoil. Instead, after a single sharp intake of breath, he leaned in closer, his weary eyes narrowing with an expression of intense, almost academic, focus. The other staff looked at him, confused by his lack of revulsion. He raised a hand, silencing the whispers that had started to erupt in the room. "Look closer," he commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble. He pointed with a gloved finger, not at the maggots themselves, but at what was happening around them. "Look at the wound bed. Look at the edges." Following his direction, the team peered past the horrifying movement. What they saw was medically inexplicable. The maggots were concentrating their activity with surgical precision, consuming only the black, dead, and rotting tissue. They left the healthy flesh completely untouched. And beneath the writhing mass, where the larvae had already cleared away the gangrenous layers, the base of the wound was not the soupy, infected mess they had expected to find. Instead, it was shockingly clean. The tissue was a healthy, pinkish red, covered in the tiny, granular bumps that signaled the growth of new, healthy tissue. There was almost no sign of the bacterial infection they had been so sure was destroying the limb that a slow wave of understanding washed over Dr. Evans's face, a look of sheer, unadulterated astonishment. "My God," he whispered, mostly to himself. "It's natural debridement." He turned to Sarah and the stunned nurses, his voice now filled with a strange energy, a mixture of awe and disbelief. "These creatures, they haven't been destroying her leg. They've been saving it." He explained that this was a raw, accidental version of a recognized medical procedure, maggot therapy. The fly larvae, laid as eggs in the dying flesh, had hatched and begun to do what nature designed them to do. They were consuming only the necrotic tissue, cleaning the wound far more effectively and gently than any surgeon's scalpel ever could. Furthermore, their secretions were powerfully antibacterial, having halted the spread of the very infection that had pushed Anna into septic shock. The disgusting things that had horrified them only moments ago were, in fact, the unlikeliest of saviors. The leg they were all certain would need to be amputated might now, impossibly, be saved. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from one of impending tragedy to one of hushed, clinical awe. The plan for amputation was immediately and unceremoniously discarded. In its place, Dr. Evans orchestrated a new, far more delicate procedure. The goal was no longer to remove a limb, but to respectfully evict its tiny, multi-legged tenants and preserve the incredible work they had done. Under the surgeon's careful guidance, the medical team began the painstaking process of irrigating the wound with a sterile saline solution. One by one, the maggots were gently flushed from the clean, pink tissue they had meticulously exposed. It was a bizarre and unprecedented form of handoff, a transition from the raw, chaotic power of nature to the measured, precise science of modern medicine. When Anna finally emerged from the fog of her fever days later, she found herself in a quiet, sunlit hospital room. Her first sensation was not of pain, but of a profound and bone-deep weakness. Her granddaughter, Sarah, was asleep in a chair by her bedside, her face pale with exhaustion. Anna's gaze drifted down the bed to her leg. It was still there, encased in a thick, clean white bandage. She could feel a dull, distant ache, but it was the ache of healing, not of decay. The memories of the past weeks were a fractured, nightmarish collage, but the memory of the pain was sharp and clear. She did not understand how she could still have her foot that it was Sarah and Dr. Evans who, together, pieced the incredible story together for her. They told her about the nail, the infection, the sepsis that had nearly claimed her life, and the last-minute decision to amputate. Then, with careful, gentle words, they told her what they had found beneath the bandage. Anna listened in stunned silence, her wrinkled face a mask of disbelief. The idea that she, a woman who put her faith in the clean, healing power of herbs and earth, had been saved by creatures she associated with filth and death was a paradox too immense to grasp. It was a humbling, almost violent, shattering of her entire worldview. The doctors she had spent a lifetime avoiding had not only saved her life, but had possessed the wisdom to recognize a miracle when they saw one that Anna's recovery was slow and arduous. A journey that tested her physically and mentally. She had to learn to trust the nurses who changed her dressings and the doctors who monitored her healing. She had to accept the insulin injections she had so long refused, finally understanding that her stubbornness was not a shield but a weapon she had turned upon herself. Through it all, Sarah was a constant presence, her guilt slowly replaced by a profound sense of relief and a renewed, fiercer love for her grandmother. Months later, Anna was back in her farmhouse. The garden was thriving once more, tended to by both her and Sarah on the weekends. Her house was still filled with herbs, but now, on her kitchen counter, a small, neat pill organizer sat next to the jar of chamomile tea. One evening, as the sun set, Anna sat on her porch, her foot propped up on the familiar stool. She ran her fingers over the scar on her foot. It was a large, puckered mark, a permanent map of her ordeal. For the rest of her life, it would serve as her reminder. It was a reminder that life is fragile, that help can arrive in the most unimaginable and grotesque of forms, and that the greatest wisdom lies not in stubborn pride, but in the humility to accept a miracle, no matter how it chooses to reveal itself.